Well, this request came in by email. This person asked, can you do a quick tip on composing in a square format as opposed to the portrait or landscape format? It seems to me that there are challenges inherent in using this format for a painting. Yes, the challenge is what it can't do. Well, the one thing about the square format is it really just doesn't have the composing capabilities as the rectangular format. So I've got three of the major things the square format for painting is lacking. And I want to talk about this because there's where the challenge is. For one thing, all the edges being the same, you really don't have any really fun composing opportunities because, for one thing, every rectangle depends upon the square portion of the rectangle in order to give you different methods or different ways of balancing your painting. So because there is no difference in that, you can put your images just about anywhere in the painting, and it's not the format itself doesn't really contribute anything to the success of the painting. For one thing, with a rectangular format, whether it's a horizontal or a vertical, we have opportunities for creating different lengths of the rectangle. Or we can create a shorter length, or we can create a longer length. So you've got lots of variation in there. And because you can do that, you have ability to do a rebatment. Because all rectangles will contain a rebatment, and the squares don't contain that. Let me show you what I'm talking about. The rebatment of a rectangle is where the square of the rectangle meets the rectangular part. So you see every rectangle has a square, has a capability of a square. And you can see that by, if I give you the length of that, and then here, ignore this part of my little deal, right here, there's the square on this side of the rectangle, and we have another square on that side. So we have the ability then to balance our painting between that square and that rectangle. And a wonderful way of composing is using a golden mean proportion. That's a little bit different. It's really the same in some instances as the rebatment, but a little different in the way we use it. So the golden mean proportion has, as you can see right here, there, every rectangle, let me just point this out, every rectangle has a division that comes right here that's a square. And that's what I pointed out about the rebatment. You can see they have the same thing on this side. Well, if we want to create a golden mean, the difference in the golden mean, the difference between this and this is an exact 1.68 proportion to the rectangle, or 0.68 to proportion to the square itself. So we can create a golden rectangle, which is a beautiful rectangle, by using the golden mean. You can't do that with a square. Within any rectangle, you can find that golden proportion just by doing what I did there. So in essence, the rebatment will also give you, in many cases, a golden proportion. So the other thing I mentioned is the directional orientation. In the square, you don't have any directional orientation. All you have is 4 equal sides. So any way you turn it, it's still going to be 4 equal sides. But in the rectangle, you have the ability to do what we call a landscape format, or you have the ability to turn that in a vertical. Now they call that a portrait format. I kind of argue with that because you can do landscapes in that too. But I like to think of it as a horizontal orientation of the canvas or a vertical orientation. That's what I mean by directional orientation, where this one has no directional orientation. So now what does that mean? The orientation of your canvas presents something about the interpretation of the painting itself. So orienting your canvas in the horizontal gives the interpretation of a more restful or less tense environment in which you can put your whatever your composition is. The vertical gives us a more sturdy feeling. For example, if you have a painting of a street in a city or whatever, and you want to emphasize that feeling of the street in those tall buildings, then the vertical orientation can participate in that interpretation because of the length of the vertical. But say if you want to do a sunset, now there are some exceptions. You can't put a sunset in a vertical orientation, and you can put a sunset in a horizontal orientation. But the actual feeling that sunsets give us is better expressed in that horizontal interpretation. So, but the square format doesn't give any ability within the format itself to give any interpretation to the painting whatsoever. So you kind of freewheeling. I've always called the square format the cheating format because there's very little composing to do. The one thing I can tell you is this, that within the format you would want your emphasis you want your image to occupy the space but not in the center. Now be careful about that. So you'd want, if it's a close-up of the image, I'll just do some little squiggle here. If it's close-up of the image, for example, you would want the image within that square to be an interesting distribution of the shape of the whole image in order to counter that boring quality that the square has. So that's one thing. Another thing is that you do have within the square something that you have within the rectangle, and that is what we call sweet spots. And the best way I know to get what we call the sweet spots means that's a good balanced place, a place to call the attention to the viewer and keep it interesting. And so one of my favorite ways to get that is with, well, let's do it this way. Go from corner to corner of the rectangle. This is a squiggly line, but you don't mind. And then from the center there, halfway right in here, are what we call sweet spots. Now that is available to us in the rectangle, but you can see we can make it much more interesting in the rectangle because we have space between those spots that we can vary to give more interest. And within the square, we don't have that degree of space to give us interest, but we do have that ability to locate the sweet spot or locate our center of interest within the sweet spot. The main thing that, as I said before, we've got to be careful about, and the challenge, part of the challenge of what this person is talking about, is that in the square, you don't just place it right in the center of the square. Don't just want to place your image right in the center like this and have this equal space left on either side, because it's boring. See, if you don't want to do boring paintings, you really are careful how you center the interest. So I think mainly the point is, if you choose to paint in squares, and there are some painters who choose to paint in squares exclusively, then you need to make your painting interesting enough so that the square itself doesn't decrease that interest, because how you handle that space inside that square is going to determine just how long the viewer wants to continue to look at the painting. Now, of course, that's true as well with the rectangle. One thing I want to backtrack just a little bit on you. I use this tool, and we have a quick tip. This tool is the tool we can use to find the golden mean in a rectangle, and it's called the Fibonacci tool. You can find it online. I think it's available through Etsy, this particular one. but you can find them online, and you can adjust it. Whatever way you adjust it, it's going to give you that proportion, a really good proportion of the that's pretty parallel to the golden rectangle. And yes, you can proportion the square, but it's going to give you, when you proportion the square, it's going to give you two unequal rectangles, which could be a very interesting way of composing within the square itself. So that's the scoop on square. And as I said before, if you choose to use the square exclusively, well then be very strategic with your composing, the way you place your shapes and how those shapes relate to the edges of that square, because that's going to determine just how interesting your painting is. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.